And I want to thank Dan and Stephen so much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really most impressed by how this has been a gathering of equals, of people who have knowledge sufficient that any one of you really could be up here to give the talk tonight. And throughout the time that I've been working on Arctic issues, I've learned so much from people who are here, Sverker, Michael, Yulia, and particularly Sheila in her writing. And I was hoping, actually, that the organizers at the conference wouldn't notice the fact that the books that I've published are actually ones that don't have Arctic in the index. However, my name stayed in the program as being at the 5 o'clock slot, so I'm going to talk about some stories, a set of different stories that may help us pull together some of the large themes that we've been talking about thus far. And I wondered too if possibly one reason that I got the invite to being here was having had a chance to teach for 2 years at 64 degrees north when I was at Fairbanks, connected with the Geophysical Institute and with the history department. What got me fully involved in Arctic research was a set of opportunities that came out of the North, particularly a call that was issued back in 2005 for a proposal, Histories from the North. And it was intriguing, and I sent an email once I knew about it to someone that I suspect many of you know, Urban Rockberg from Kirkenes, currently in Norway, said that one of my project managers at NSF had called my attention to it, thought it was worth pursuing, and asked Urban, what did you think? And Urban, in his marvelously clear way, dissected what was going on, looked at the proposal, and his key worry was that it looked like it might be written for anthropologists and not for historians. And then he added, if you take on the role as project leader, let's go forward with this. And it's a photograph. I'm glad that I was able to get Yulia, who's here, of course, talking with Urban when we had a meeting at Florida State a number of years ago. And of course, it turns out Michael's colleague at Scott Polar, Piers Vitebsky, was in fact one of the architects of that project, of setting up this larger call for Histories from the North. If memory serves, 5 of the funded teams of the 7 were primarily involving anthropologists, but there was one team that involved historians. And that happened to be the one that we had put together. We were just so thrilled that one of the reviewers had talked about a hunting license, which gave a way of trying to create a narrative saying, please grant a hunting license for us, which meant please give us some money. And that worked. We were one of the teams that did get funded for that project. And one of the marvelous things is that it brought together some of the people who are here, some of whom have already presented at this meeting. There's a list of the full team, and I think it's better to actually see these people. And we had a number of meetings, and unfortunately, we never were able to have a meeting of everybody in the team at one time, which meant that Michael, and we're so sorry, we didn't have that photo of you in there. The consolation prize is that every time we've shown this photograph, Michael has hovered over the rest of us. Our charge, what we promised to do for the European Science Foundation, was not to produce national stories, but to take what seemed to be the more important topics that we could address and see if we could do transnational, internationally comparative histories, stories that would unite the North. And we were very fortunate that the editors of the Journal of Historical Geography thought this a good idea, and this came out in 2014. You'll note all of these are jointly written, and the teams were deliberately assembled so that we would have perspectives from different nations, different geographic regions to try to get at issues of common interest. And I wanted to tell a story, too, about a different project, a separate project that got proposed to the Carlsberg Foundation. Had been in draft for about a year before a meeting that took place in January in 2010. And it was a project that was coming out of Aarhus University, principally up here in the mid part of Denmark. And the Carlsberg Foundation, as many of you know, has been a supporter of major projects in the history of science and related fields. And the concept, Matthias had been a principal in developing it. I was involved in some of the proposal writing for the comparative part, was to look at Greenland in the Cold War, science and technology. And if it's all right if I pause, can I tell you a quick story about a bathroom break? Bathrooms have been in the news in the United States, and it's not a happy story, which you know. But this is a different kind of story. We had just gotten out of meeting with the Carlsberg Foundation board. We'd been in there for an hour. Matthias made his part of his pitch. We were all making points. And we're led out by one of the executive assistants. And she begins by saying, you know, our proposals are quite competitive. It's hard to get them. Matthias, at that point, went to take a bathroom break. But the administrative assistant kept talking to me. She said, but you made a really good presentation. You were wise to bring in a declassified document because one of the Carlsberg questions was likely to be, can you get access to these documents that you claim you're going to need in order to tell the story? And you just presented it really well. The board members cared about it. And Matthias starts coming back at that point. She says, and you know, it's going to be a little while until we can tell you what happened. Poor Matthias. This was the photograph of how tense he looked after that discussion at Carlsberg. He said, I heard that story. We're not going to get it. And I said, you missed the crucial part of that story. We have a good chance. And he still wasn't quite convinced. And since it was Carlsberg Foundation, I then treated him to a Carlsberg beer in saying, this is going to be good luck. And the fortunate thing is, they did fund that project as well. It was slightly north of $1 million US to support this team that involved postdocs and some of the principal people. We combined folks from Florida and Aarhus. And another view of the team members, we would have had Janet here if health had allowed her to travel, and we're very glad to see Henrik here. And it involved research out in the United States, including at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. And you can see Matthias is a bit more relaxed at this point. And I will leave it to dinner when you might want to ask Henrik why he had to wear a band on his arm when he is there on the lawn. It's actually a good story, but perhaps appropriate over certain beverages. In the Greenland project, one of the wonderful things was sometimes opening the newspaper, or not even having to open it, and seeing on the front page stories of Greenland, for those who may not know Danish, fighting in the Arctic. It happened to be about the Nazi presence, setting up weather stations and other observation posts in Greenland during World War II. And that work from the Greenland project has all come together. We were supposed to have received the proofs yesterday. They still haven't arrived from the copy editors, but it will be. That's the book that is coming out quite soon. And that's one kind of storytelling. I wanted to touch on two other stories and then a few very short stories that may perhaps help us to pull together some of the larger themes and issues that have come up in this meeting today. And in part because work that I've done has been in diplomatic history. Dawn raised the point of what we can get from focusing on diplomatic history. I wanted to see what we might learn about one of those major projects that had a toehold, a strong presence in the Arctic, the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58, stories that connect diplomatic history and history of science, what kind of narratives to tell. And if this seems to be a clearer version of this published image than not, it's because it's actually an original copy. That's my thumb holding the image that showed up in the Chapman papers at University of Alaska, Fairbanks. The historiography, the stories we're telling about the IGY have certainly shifted in the more than 50 years since the IGY took place. Alan Needell at the Smithsonian, I think, captures it in talking about now historians agreeing on the complex roots that are deeply intertwined with geopolitics, nationalism, and military and security concerns. And those are a few of the books, including some very recent, that have explored those interconnections between national security interests and the IGY. And we can see visually some of the evidence that historians have been displaying, the rockets that are coming from defense centers, including here in Canada. We're seeing a Churchill launch there. Some recent work that's going on over in Germany, the Max Planck Institute, Elena Aronova, in correlating the IGY stations. You can see what the group over there is beginning to find. And much of what's been written have been narratives of conflict, of putting the exploration of the pole in terms of national security, concerns over World War III. And I think it was also Dawn that had this marvelous illustration out of Look magazine, centering the Thule base, newly constructed at that period of time. You see it on the right-hand side. A technological feat that some then reckoned to be similar to building the Panama Canal, and I don't think that much of an exaggeration. Centering a narrative upon not miles, but airplane distance. And many understood the issue was those planes could be carrying nuclear weapons. It's a key point in the Cold War. And there wasn't, and Sverker in his presentation was drawing on parts of this larger story. And in fact, it was Paul Seipel who wrote, in thinking about operating in the Arctic, that the Arctic, once a barrier, is now a potential, if not the logical, invasion route. Richard Byrd, in some material that's just become declassified, made similar recommendations to the Pentagon. We've been talking already today, we have those stories already in context. This just to help put things in still further global context. Out of the archives in Canberra comes an indication that at the highest levels, the development of the weather stations, the facilities in the far north, were still of concern throughout the larger British Empire, communicated at high levels, prominent flags put on them, bringing attention to what's going on geopolitically. And we also heard mention, I think it might have been Matthew had mentioned the Defense Research Board, similar to the one in the United States. And here we see geophysical research of prime importance in the Arctic because of unique features there. There's an enlargement of that particular quote. This was the version in the United States, the Research and Development Board. Apologies, I didn't spell it out. That is the RDB that is mentioned there. When I'm teaching undergraduates, I ask them to take a look through these environmental sciences fields and see which ones aren't mentioned, and it usually takes them a few moments before they raise the B word. Where's biology in this mix? And of course, the focus within this panel, but even more generally, is at the time on understanding the physical environment. And why were they so interested? This diagram, Time magazine, 1946. 46, that's so far before Sputnik that that's a really nice guess, right, about what the first satellite might indeed look like. But understanding how planes moved through the physical environment, the V2s going ever higher, New Mexico, and the anticipated move into space meant that everything in this column, the illustration doesn't include submarines, but it was just as clear. We can see it here. Oceanography, why does it matter? Undersea warfare. The whole realm of physical oceanography seen as important. The environment written here in terms of a utilitarian type of investigation. And a story that hasn't, at least is just beginning to be explored in increasing depth, the relationships between what was initially the secret Project Sunshine to understand how far radioactivity had traveled around the globe, coming from the Pacific tests, the United States testing of atomic weapons, and using this as a tracer. And very similar to the way, Andrew, in which you were talking about what can happen if oil is a tracer. Here, it's radioactivity, and there's the open, visible IGY component, but there's also a very different project that is, in many respects, kept secret until the 1990s when it gained some notoriety. And those are familiar stories, and I think there's much to commend in them, but I wanted to revisit some of those narratives that attempted to posit cooperation, scientific internationalism, and see what we might learn about larger dynamics that influenced how major international activities like the IGY actually took place, what shaped them as they were being formed up, and the ultimate results that came from that. Here you see on the red scoring on the side, these are not mild rhetorical claims, right? They're over-the-top superlative type claims. Most successful cooperative enterprise ever undertaken by, well, we're in 2016, humans. But it goes beyond, I think, those who were involved in the project. Walter Sullivan, who was one of the major science writers for the New York Times, one looks at the dedication. He sees this. He's writing as an objective reporter, but he interjects his view of the role, the significance of an enterprise like the IGY here, and begins the second chapter of that history of the IGY, quoting from Hugh Odeshaw. And if you thought those earlier quotes were over the top, how about making it the most significant? You can read what's there. Since the Renaissance and the Copernican Revolution. But not since humans evolved altogether. Okay. Why are these issues so important to describe in these terms? How do we understand some of the key figures in the IGY as individuals to better understand their motives, their emotions, their way of understanding this particular history? And this is one of the unexpected things that we sometimes find in an archive. Sidney Chapman writing here to one of the other leaders in the organizational hierarchy of the IGY, to Nicolay, saying, we have collected these rather confidential and troubling papers about what went on in the IGY. Should they be destroyed or should they be given to a library? And should the papers be kept or destroyed, and in what time frame? And Chapman clearly favors preserving them for history. Nicolay, not so much. And there is Nicolay, and here is his response. It's in French, but we're here in Canada, so we can allow that to be up. And he says something that might affect all of you. No, we need to destroy these papers because future historians can never really understand how these things came about. But that's you. That's everyone here in the room, right? Chapman may have thought about it for a few nanoseconds. I don't know exactly what he wrote back, but in essence, this is what he communicated back to Nicolay, and the papers are now happily residing here in, and of course, University of Alaska Fairbanks has a building named after Sidney Chapman. I think that story is important because it's telling us something about what to look for that may have affected how the IGY played out. And the two key stories that I wanted to present, one of them about the Department of State, the other about the CIA, but within the framework of scientific internationalism. And how did the US government, not the White House, but agencies of the larger state, affect practice, international practice, hence international relations, hence the larger structure of the IGY, who got to play, who didn't, what kind of knowledge was produced. And part of that story has to do with the question, why was China, mainland China, ultimately not part of the IGY? A limitation on the circulation, indeed, of the production of knowledge. There, a basic chronology, post-Stalin's death, the Soviet Union joins not only the IGY, but a number of the major international scientific unions, and the People's Republic, mainland China, accepts 1 year later, and that's one of the major research facilities in the mainland. But there's a surprise that comes in 1956. It's a letter that comes from Formosa, the other China. It's late 1956. It's to Nicolay, and it's a request to have Formosa, not mainland China, represent the IGY for China. And he makes the argument, and it goes on, it lays out the history, but then makes the point, these are not legitimate scientists. They're coming out of behind the Iron Curtain. We cannot trust research that's being done in this kind of totalitarian environment. And if some of that rhetoric, that language sounds familiar, remember that James Conant, president of Harvard University, has helped to develop a narrative that's widely accepted then in the United States, that the best way for science to flourish and produce relevant good technologies is for it to be rooted in a democracy. And a science that is within closed circles is going to be weaker, won't produce the goods. And you can see the request, kick that other illegitimate China out, we want to be the representatives. It created, as you can imagine, quite a problem. And Archibald Day, one of the people charged with helping to carry out the IGY planning, is in retrospect perhaps a bit naive about what's going on. He talks about the US concern, but then says maybe we can get the US to simply get Taiwan to pull out, to allow the IGY to continue. And the essence of the issue becomes very clear as Chapman and Belousov, you saw him also in that photograph. He is one of the leading members of the planning group for the IGY in the Soviet Union. Chapman makes the point it's only Formosa that's tried to limit who can play ball in the IGY. And Chapman, after sending that note, goes further. He starts typing out what he knows, including that there seems to be quite a bit of pressure coming from Formosa to play ball in this enterprise. And after a point, he stops typing. He gets out his pen. He continues writing about trying to make sense of this and asks the question, who asked for Taiwan? How did all this come about? Belousov responds with what becomes an argument at the highest levels of the IGY. We need to embrace best science practices, elite science. What's going to lead to the best, most productive results? Chapman agrees. He doesn't want to have Formosa not be part of it if they want to play ball. But what really mattered for the IGY was to have mainland China play an absolutely central role. And into this comes some of the leaders of the IGY in mainland China, including Ko Ching-ku, who is familiar with the United States. You can see he has a degree out of Harvard. And he raises, in essence, we are under enormous political pressure here. We can't accede to having two Chinas, at least that's the official, what we think is going to be the case. Don't let politics get in the way of the IGY. We can see here, as the story begins to unfold, these issues go on. Turns out, in the long run, see near the bottom, just before the IGY starts, mainland China does withdraw. And the question is why? And what's clear from many archives that have been surveyed now to get some answers is that neither Chapman nor Belousov fully understood the attitudes of the US Department of State, particularly in the first, say, 6-7 years of Eisenhower's presidency, the central role that Formosa played, and the conservative-leaning political and scientific advice that Eisenhower was getting. They may not have put so much credence on reports that were appearing in magazines that the International Science Office was an out-and-out stinkhole of communists. But what that reflected was the intensity of what we know as the China hands. Those that thought the US had lost China and were determined to make certain that everything be done to push mainland China down and support the only legitimate part of China. And the China hands, those that were embittered by what happened in 1949, included Macaulay. And he was well known. There's a later photograph of him accompanying President John F. Kennedy. And at this time that letter appears coming from Formosa, Communist China was lobbing some shells onto uninhabited islands that Taiwan, Formosa claimed just off the coast. And for the China hands in the Department of State, that was the start of World War III. It had begun. And it turns out, the archives now make clear, it was Macaulay, one individual in the Department of State, who went to Formosa to encourage, indeed to demand, that the leaders of the Formosan Academy of Sciences apply to be part of the IGY, because that would give the Department of State leverage to deny mainland China to be part. That would be the instructions that came, and Chapman, increasingly worried, he takes this down, the instructions from the Department of State, the threat that the USA may withdraw itself, not play a role if Taiwan was not ultimately allowed to be involved. And we were paying too much attention also to the views of the Soviet Union. And in States, gambit succeeds. And I think what's interesting is to see what happens with these issues on the level of the international meetings. And there was one here, not far down the road in Toronto, 1957, just as the IGY is starting. And the documents that have begun to emerge out of the archives showing the scientists, the US representatives, knew that they had political instructions going into that meeting, what they could propose, what they were officially not to support. Morris Ewing of Columbia University saying two things. First quote here, basically, if we couldn't get to these meetings, we would have thought the Soviet claims about their knowledge production were bunk. But now we're in contact with them, we know they're right. And also, if the people from other countries knew what he was instructed to do, the United States proposals would have gone so quickly down the drain. It would have been a major issue. Another story that I think is worth telling in this context, it's a very different kind of story from Central Intelligence Agency. How do we figure this entity dealing with scientific as well as other forms of intelligence into this story? It's a kind of scary looking group, isn't it, of the major leaders, those who were involved in setting up scientific intelligence. It's clear from the material that's been declassified that the initial concern of the science office in CIA was really focused on physics, chemistry, what related to predicting the Soviet development of atomic weapons. And it's also of interest that when, and I don't unfortunately have a copy here of the cover of a report that assessed what happened if neutral Sweden were overrun. The Soviets took it over and they grabbed all the scientists. What would the national security implications be? And Sverker, I suspect you know that what this report missed was Hans Ullmann and his work on climate and trying to understand the larger geopolitics. And it was something that the CIA very quickly began to recognize was a limit. And there are intergovernmental politics that limited what the CIA could initially do. But what's come clear from the documents that have emerged so far is that the analysts working in CIA are very much aware, and something that I've learned a great deal about from those of you here, particularly Yulia, the extent to which Soviet researchers were already masters of the Arctic and had been since the late 20s, early 1930s. The attempt to understand what the Soviets knew became a major issue, certainly by the mid-1950s. Here we see a partially declassified assessment, recent developments in the Soviet Arctic, pointing to the need, again, to get an understanding of the physical branches of the environmental sciences there and the justification because it matters for missiles, among other things. But I think there's some even more interesting and important documents that are in the so far declassified set of Soviet Arctic materials. Interest in gathering intelligence about changing natural conditions, including the sea ice, not just in the western areas of the Arctic, but also in the eastern area. Assessments of the strength of Soviet science, its reliability, countering some of the narratives that were very common about Soviet ideology damaging so much of Soviet science, saying here, Soviet Union post-Stalin is very involved in that broad range of the physical and physical environmental sciences. They are seeking all kinds of information through whatever means are possible and make clear, yes, Lysenko did damage deeply Soviet genetics, Western-style genetics research, but don't use that as a justification for ignoring the rest. And I think what's particularly interesting is that they are also deeply involved in that meeting in Toronto. But they are, in contrast to the Department of State, encouraging as much international interactions as can be possible, because they are convinced they're only going to know about best science and how to tell what best science is if there is more open communication. There's a great deal of interest in the geoid, figuring out the shape and the specific gravity of parts of the Earth for calculating missile trajectories. But here's where I think it gets even more interesting, and I highlighted a part of this quote here, that this research is not just for Soviet national security or military issues, but broader economic, social benefits that can possibly come. They are looking at these issues on a global scale. They make an assessment that the Soviets are far ahead of researchers in the West. It's, at the time, a quite accurate assessment. And that it goes on to make a critique that Soviet research is there for the long haul. The bases are more or less permanent. The gathering of information is broader than what's needed for any one particular military need in the moment. You can see that particular quote. But the contrast is to the US. On the other hand, it's primarily a military activity subject to vagaries of the annual budget cycle and shifts in military requirements. US, you're missing the boat. And I raise a different question. Who is it writing these reports? We know very, very little about analysts within the CIA. We know that that first generation of people recruited for the CIA tended to be the humanists, the political scientists coming out of Yale and Princeton, people who knew politics and did not particularly know science. And yet, we have an instance here where there's a clearly reflection of a deep understanding of what's going on. And I raise this in part because other research I had a chance to do years ago on Soviet astronomy and claims made clear that certain leading US astrophysicists were able, content, willing to go into the black for a period of time to communicate directly their impressions of what was going on in the Soviet research community to help the CIA issue planning and guidance statements to the White House that reflected the best sense of what the science was at the time. And all that got me thinking of someone I had a chance to interview along with a friend and colleague some years back, Ken Hunkins. We see him up here. He is on the ice Iowan T3. At the time, Norbert Untersteiner from the University of Washington was calling him a modern-day von Humboldt because he had freedom to do such a wide latitude of research projects given the sparsity, the lack of US knowledge on much fundamental information about what was going on in the Arctic. And there is perhaps one of the more detailed assessments of Ken Hunkins and his career, first one from 1960 and then from 2007. And I raise that in part because the interview with Hunkins came about because of a large project Columbia University did to interview within the framework of Columbia some 60 people connected with this earth science research facility, including their spouses, ship captains, all manner of people. And we gathered as much biographical material as possible, and that's just one drawer, right, of some of the material. There was no file for Ken Hunkins. Why was there no file? Hunkins, as he later began to talk about in his oral history, made clear much of his career was in the black. What he never could publish, even what he wrote and published, was classified and hence unavailable. And if you want an example of what that looks like, this is a now partially declassified, classified journal, right, that only circulates within a specific community. But it got me thinking, Ken Hunkins is too young to have played an individual role in that set of CIA reports that we saw a moment ago, but who else may have been involved? Who else traveled back and forth between open communities of researchers potentially and the CIA, parallel to the case that we already know in history of modern astrophysics? David Kaiser captured this quote, which I think is just marvelous for this case. If the best way to transmit information is to wrap it up in a person, what did it mean when people like Ken Hunkins had a largely secret professional community? Perhaps that barrier between science in black and more open forms of science may be a little bit more porous than we may have imagined. I think that's one question we may want to consider. And I want to end with just a few short stories, quite short stories. And I was so glad that some of the presentations this afternoon began to talk about images and photography and larger narratives. There's a set of photographs that didn't get wide circulation, it seems, at the time. Harold Corsini, the photographer, was sent up to Norman Wells. We saw it, at least briefly, on one of the maps that was shown. We can see it up here, its location as well. What may not be so widely known is that this is not a less well-known staff photographer of a government agency, but he is part of that group that Roy Stryker put together for the photography, the Farm Security Administration, FSA project, joining the ranks of some of the leading documentary photographers of that period of time, Gordon Parks and Jack Delano, and some of the women photographers, Esther Bubley and Marjorie Collins, and of course the husband-wife team at the end. This is some of the, of course, the photography, and when we see this work, we're not thinking of the kinds of stories, narratives that historians tend to provide, but emotion. And it reminds me, there's a very interesting article that's being widely discussed in the moment. Frank Castiglioga in the Journal of American History, I react openly to everything. It's George Kennan's Russia, his frustrated emotions, raising the question, what are we missing when we don't look carefully at the emotional lives of the people whom we're researching and how it affects how they think about the actions that they're taking. And it's a reminder, I've shown photographs almost entirely of men. This has been such a gendered story, but we're not seeing in many of these narratives the influence of the spouses and what effect that may have had on the narratives that we tell. I'm reminded of the historian of science turned anthropologist of science, Sharon Strawick, who wrote recently that physicists tend to discount the narratives written by professional historians of science because the emotion isn't there. They remember the hallway arguments, the fights, the games, and they don't see the narratives of rational actors debating key points to capture what matters for them. One short story. Here's another quick short story. We've been talking about the stories, and Heather was talking about those that were published. What about those that were written but for various reasons during the Cold War could not be published? Jim Lucas, who becomes a Pulitzer Prize winner, did a series of remarkable stories. He accompanied U.S. officials flying throughout the North. And there we see, this is when it becomes an issue for Canada because of sovereignty, but his articles are retyped and sent as teletypes between Ottawa and Washington. You can see some of the quotes. These are ultimately killed stories, narratives that did not circulate. And I wonder how many of these are there that we can talk about? If one looks at the New York Times in that period, so many of the stories do in 1947 reflect military issues. And yet, there are stories that get killed. What influence might that have caused? Third short story, another one with limited circulation. Again, it's an issue that Sverker and I, for various projects, have been very interested in. Discussions as national security issues begin to affect the Arctic of the decline of sea ice once there's pressure to measure sea ice. Graham Rowley, there's an image of Graham Rowley, is communicating to his superiors, there's something big going on up there, and we may have an ice-free in the summer Arctic Ocean in half a century if the trend line doesn't change. And we can see here some of the marginalia. It's a story that's circulating to a certain extent. At highest levels, we don't know, I think, fully what that story is. Some of you may be working on it. I do think it may be one of the most important ones that we can consider handling. Another quick short story, the penultimate one, Indigenous and Western exchange of knowledge is reminded, and this happens to be an image that I'm so glad is going to be in the Greenland book upcoming. I was thinking of Julie Cruikshank in making her point about how before recent times we had narrative stories that joined, particularly from the Native communities, natural, social, cultural worlds, all disintegrated in the moment, fragmented. And the question she raises is, what is the consequence of this fragmentation? And I think, Henrik, you were the one who also raised the B-52 crash just to the west of Thule Air Base. And it was the one time, because there was such need to clean up the ice as quickly and, of course, in one sense, as secretively as possible, that the members of the local Native communities did have interaction with the Americans as part of the cleanup effort. What insights began to emerge? What exchange? What did the exchange do? How did it affect that local community? And I told you all early that story about Matthias, an anecdote, which probably may be the only thing you remember out of what we talked about here in the moment. But I think it may be more important than we may realize. The oral historian Trevor Loomis reminds us that we communicate very often when we're talking with one another with anecdotes, with short stories like this. And he says these are stories about the acquisition of moral value, why things mattered to people, not just what happened. Finally, in a question that I think addresses us in our present time very much and is part of a historical question, who are the public intellectuals of the Arctic region? How do we even think about who are public intellectuals? Hans Ullmann, major figure who publicly circulates his understanding of the globe warming up, a lecture that he gives in 1947, but we also know that he went to the Research and Development Board in Washington, spoke secretly to that group, and shared a very similar story. A public intellectual with large private influence, or at least state influence. What about people in our own time who are telling particular stories and narratives about the North? We're still stuck in some ways in that Cold War. This is what it looked like going into the archives in Washington, D.C. last summer. Documents still kept from view, fragmented narratives. This is what some narratives still look like. Some of you know the work of the historian Peter Harrison. He's writing about really about Enlightenment period, that time in which there's a disaggregation of moral authority and science, natural philosophy narratives, which he calls the dissociation of wisdom and science. The rise of modernity, the application of material culture through technology. It's an echo, perhaps, of that fragmentation that we heard in Julie Cruikshank's argument about what sort of things we've lost. And I raise this just as a question: how do we think about developing still more inclusive narratives? I'm just fascinated by that question of how we think about storytelling, and I'm trusting it's something that we can get to at the final discussion here in the workshop. And I am your impediment for dinner. I want to thank you so much for listening and staying with this all the way through.
As many in this room can speak to, not to mention yourself, the debates about the IGY and the degree to which it was militarized, or whether this was scientists doing what diplomats could not do, is rife. And I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit more than you already have to that debate and the militarization theme that you've kind of emphasized, or at least the Cold War theme you've emphasized here, not militarization outright.
There's another story I didn't get a chance to tell here, a short one, okay. Okay, can I tell one more quick short story? There was a big debate going on in the end of the Eisenhower period, 1960, between Wallace Broad. You remember the fellow who was the first head of CIA science? He becomes ever more conservative. He becomes science advisor at State. He adopts State's attitudes, and he says, we have to limit international science. It's not doing us any good. We can do hemispheric science, and it'll work just fine. George Kiski-Akowski, the chemist, the Manhattan Project veteran who is now Eisenhower's science advisor, says, we need more international science. And one of the declassified documents that's come to light says, he's writing directly to Eisenhower, look at what we are now about to do in Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe. And I would really love to know just what he was thinking about. But it's clear he's making an argument that scientists are going to be better than the diplomats in affecting the kind of change we want to see in Eastern Europe. And ultimately, it's not even close. Eisenhower comes to the National Security Council meeting where this is being debated and says, we are going to continue to support internationalism. He changes his own view to an extent from what he had embraced early in his, or allowed to happen in the State Department when he wasn't paying attention. I think there are many more stories of that sort still to cover. One last quick story. If you want to try to get some more archival material, please write to the Kennedy Presidential Library and say, it's now 50 years. Could you please declassify the science advisor's records? Okay, they're already open for the Johnson Presidential Library and some of the subsequent ones.
Thanks, Sean, for a great talk. So many things. What you would have liked to ask about, but I will limit myself to one, and that is your take on the Cold War. I mean, this is the remit of this conference. We have a Cold War period here, but leading question, isn't it a little bit also that we frame our stories, you want to pluralize them, you want to open them up. There is something with the concept itself that tends to trap us in certain dimensions. This is a period, historically, when so many other things happen. I'm glad you bring in Formosa, but there was the Green Revolution,
exactly.
There was decolonization,
exactly.
There was things going on in the marketization of societies. It is change everywhere, so many things with the media and so on. And sometimes I get the sense that we have a very thick lens looking at a particular geography with a particular mindset. And, this was question enough.
And I think it's a marvelous question. It came up at a conference that was in Leiden 2 years ago that's now resulted in the new book on Cold War science that Jeroen Dongen edited. And one question that came up, for instance, on this point is, where are we comfortable to say this seems to be Cold War science versus it's happening in the Cold War period? Because otherwise, everything is Cold War science, and then it has no explanatory power left. And I was really intrigued. A number of you were beginning to raise economic issues and oil issues, and there clearly are geopolitics coming in, but are those geopolitics in a way similar to what had occurred in the pre-World War II period that continue, that may have less reflection, right? And I think it's a marvelous question that we need to keep pursuing.
Thanks,
Peter.
Ron, not least for a wonderfully inspiring reminder to dig and find things in archives. And the more one digs, the more interesting things one finds. My question is about, I see the 50s, amongst other things, as being one of the high points of planning. And the idea that not only economies can be planned, but worlds can be planned, as much as scientific organisations too. And yet at the same time, I think you make a really nice case for not only the function of individual actors in enacting state aims, and the idea that the state's tentacles can really come into many different areas. But at the same time, can you say perhaps something about what this says about this particular time period? The extent to which states, particularly the Cold War superpowers, are able to expect that they can exert agency in a way that I don't know if even a colonial power before 1939 might have thought possible.
Yep.
And what that perhaps says about the way we should think about the agency of individuals vis-a-vis the agencies of states in this period.
And thank you for that, and I think it's a great question, and I was so glad that Sheila, you are raising the point of the role of individuals in trying to tell stories of these developments. Most of you will know that John Krieger wrote recently the book on American hegemony and looking at the influence of the US on Western Europe. And what I think has been most interesting is that it's inspired historians, particularly in Holland and Belgium and the smaller states, to see, is this a story that really connects us with Germany and France? Or is it one that's pan-Western Europe? And there are cracks, not only in my voice, but in that narrative, that as those researchers have begun to see the limits of that influence. And I think it's going to be one of the more interesting ways to do it. Can I just add, and this isn't responsive just to that question, but we talk about trying to understand the IGY, and yet we still have narrative stories really about the half dozen major players. And we would so want, I think, to hear how participating in the IGY change science cultures or science political relations in these other states. So there's so many stories that we don't have yet, and you're pointing to that.
Well, with that, I'd like everyone to join me, please, in thanking Professor Doel.
Thank you. Geophysical Institute and with the history department. What got me fully involved in Arctic research was a set of opportunities that came out of the North, particularly a call that was issued back in 2005 for a proposal, Histories from the North. And it was intriguing, and I sent an email once I knew about it to someone that I suspect many of you know, Urban Rockberg from Kirkenes, currently in Norway, said that one of my project managers at NSF had called my attention to it, thought it was worth pursuing, and asked Urban, what did you think? And Urban, in his marvelously clear way, dissected what was going on, looked at the proposal, and his key worry was that it looked like it might be written for anthropologists and not for historians. And then he added, if you take on the role as project leader, let's go forward with this. And it's a photograph. I'm glad that I was able to get Yulia, who's here, of course, talking with Urban when we had a meeting at Florida State a number of years ago. And of course, it turns out Michael's colleague at Scott Polar, Piers Vitebsky, was in fact one of the architects of that project, of setting up this larger call for histories from the North. If memory serves, 5 that we could address and see if we could do transnational, internationally comparative histories, stories that would unite the North. And we were very fortunate that the editors of the Journal of Historical Geography thought this a good idea, and this came out in 2014. You'll note all of these are jointly written, and the teams were deliberately assembled so that we would have perspectives from different nations, different geographic regions to try to get at issues of common interest. And I wanted to tell a story, too, about a different project, a separate project that got proposed to the Carlsberg Foundation. Had been in draft for about a year before a meeting that took place in January in 2010. And it was a project that was coming out of Aarhus University, principally up here in the mid part of Denmark. And the Carlsberg Foundation, as many of you know, has been a supporter of major projects in the history of science and related fields. And the concept, Matthias had been a principal in developing it. I was involved in some of the proposal writing for the comparative part, was to look at Greenland in the Cold War, science and technology. And if it's all right if I pause, can I tell you a quick story? The funded teams of the 7 were primarily involving anthropologists, but there was one team that involved historians, and that happened to be the one that we had put together. We were just so thrilled that one of the reviewers had talked about a hunting license, which gave a way of trying to create a narrative saying, please grant a hunting license for us, which meant please give us some money. And that worked. We were one of the teams that did get funded for that project. And one of the marvelous things is that it brought together some of the people who are here, some of whom have already presented at this meeting. There's a list of the full team, and I think it's better to actually see these people. And we had a number of meetings, and unfortunately, we never were able to have a meeting of everybody in the team at one time, which meant that Michael, and we're so sorry, we didn't have that photo of you in there. The consolation prize is that every time we've shown this photograph, Michael has hovered over the rest of us. Our charge, what we promised to do for the European Science Foundation, was not to produce national stories, but to take what seemed to be the more important topics that And I want to thank Dan and Stephen so much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm really most impressed by how this has been a gathering of equals, of people who have knowledge sufficient that any one of you really could be up here to give the talk tonight. And throughout the time that I've been working on Arctic issues, I've learned so much from people who are here, Sverker, Michael, Yulia, and particularly Sheila in her writing. And I was hoping, actually, that the organizers at the conference wouldn't notice the fact that the books that I've published are actually ones that don't have Arctic in the index. However, my name stayed in the program as being at the 5 o'clock slot, so I'm going to talk about some stories, a set of different stories that may help us pull together some of the large themes that we've been talking about thus far. And I wondered too if possibly one reason that I got the invite to being here was having had a chance to teach for 2 years at 64 degrees north when I was at Fairbanks, connected with the about a bathroom break. Bathrooms have been in the news in the United States, and it's not a happy story, which you know. But this is a different kind of story. We had just gotten out of meeting with the Carlsberg Foundation Board. We'd been in there for an hour. Matthias made his part of his pitch. We were all making points. And we're led out by one of the executive assistants. And she begins by saying, you know, our proposals are quite competitive. It's hard to get them. Matthias, at that point, went to take a bathroom break. But the administrative assistant kept talking to me, and she said, but you made a really good presentation. You were wise to bring in a declassified document because one of the Carlsberg questions was likely to be, can you get access to these documents that you claim you're going to need in order to tell the story? And you just presented it really well. The board members cared about it. And Matthias starts coming back at that point. She says, and you know, it's going to be a little while until we can tell you what happened. Poor Matthias. This was the photograph of how tense he looked after the that discussion at Carlsberg. He said, I heard that story. We're not going to get it. And I said, you missed the crucial part of that story. We have a good chance. And